Hey everybody, how are you today? So today we're moving into chapter 9, section 3, and we're really moving towards the end of World War One. So last time we talked about how the United States was preparing, or what we call mobilizing for war. Well, while the United States was preparing or mobilizing for war, Russia was deciding to leave World War One. Now this is a big deal because since the Allies are losing a major power with a huge population that was fighting in the Eastern Front, it's going to have a huge impact on the war overall. So first, let's talk about why Russia leaves World War One, and then we're going to go into the battles that actually end World War One today, and then we'll have one last lecture that I'll put out on Monday, which will be kind of about the peace treaties of World War One. Monday will also be reviewing for the test, and then the test will go out next Wednesday. It will be considered like the test day, but you'll have all the way up until Friday, February 5th to take it. So let's talk about Russia's exit from the war. Basically, we had said from the very beginning that Russia was struggling in World War I. If you think back to the first battle in the Eastern Front, the first real major offensive by the Germans at the Battle of Tannenberg, Russia was already almost pushed out of the war at the very beginning. Tsar Nicholas II, their leader, had very little training. Russia, really had not really kind of gotten their troops ready for battle. They didn't have great battle strategies. And earlier conflicts that Russia had gotten involved in, where they'd almost gone to war with Japan and other nations, had all been a disaster because of Tsar Nicholas II's lack of leadership, lack of command, lack of strategies. They didn't have enough technology. I showed you some pictures earlier in this chapter about their attempted tanks and such were just highly inadequate compared to what they were going up against from the Germans and the British. And they don't have enough food supplies. Remember, we talked about the Battle of Gallipoli and how that was an important battle because the Central Powers, Germany and such, had blocked off the Dardanelles, that strait, and so no food or supplies was really getting into Russia. They were struggling to really make ends meet because they were not really an advanced country. They were agricultural based, so they really needed food and supplies from the Allied powers. And so that battle at Gallipoli was waged so they could try to get in food and supplies and, kind of help Russia, but little help was coming. And so by 1915, early on, as only kind of the first year of the war came to a close, the Russian people were really starting to say, we need out of this war. This is going to be a disaster. We're not going to win. We're all going to perish. We are starving. Whatever food we do have is going to the front. And we're seeing high casualty rates. The Tsar is telling us to fight, even though we lack the technology and the weapons. We don't believe in this pan-Slavism, this idea that all Serbs should support each other and all people of the same Slavic background. We don't want to fight this war anymore. And so Russia really descends upon a civil war. And we've really got two groups going on here. One group in Russia is very traditional, and they support the guy in the top picture, which is Tsar Nicholas II and his family. They're part of the Romanov family, and they've ruled Russia for basically 300 years at this point, since the 1600s, when the time of troubles came to an end and their family came to power. They are very conservative in their views. They don't really want to share power with anyone else. In recent years in Russia, there had been attempts to kind of take power from the Tsar to make it what we call a constitutional monarchy. Those have not gone well. A few short years earlier, when Tsar Nicholas II claimed he was going to give more power to the people, and they showed up at his palace. It was an event called Bloody Sunday, where he literally butchered them all and had his guards basically let them into the palace gates. And then when they were surrounded by the palace guards, they were all slaughtered. So he's not willing to really kind of listen to anyone else, so to speak, except for his wife and his wife's advisor. And his wife's advisor is this man, Rasputin. And the reason that his wife is listening to this advisor, Rasputin, the mad monk, this monk holy man, so to speak, is somewhat of a doctor. And he's using Eastern medicine plus a whole bunch of hodgepodge, a lot of hocus pocus here to claim that he can cure their son, who is a hemophiliac. So he's got a blood clotting disorder. And his son is heir to the throne. And they want to save their child, so they're willing to do anything and listen to this man. And it becomes clear to people that I'll go back a picture, just so you can see that he does have a rather large family, right? So even though he does have an heir to the throne, heaven forbid he could have let one of his daughters rule. He did have other children if something had happened to his son, but he was desperate to have his son be next in line. And while he's off waging war at the front, not being a very good commander, honestly, His wife is basically letting Rasputin kind of advise her how to run the country. And eventually people get angry. They decide they're going to murder Rasputin. The story of Rasputin's death is almost comical. He gets kidnapped, or I shouldn't say he's really kidnapped. First off, he's kind of lured into this dinner party where they thought they would poison him. He doesn't die from the poison, so then they basically end up kidnapping him. They attempt to stab him. He doesn't die from the stabbing. They shoot him. He doesn't die from the gunshot wound. They eventually drowned him, and he dies, we think, from suffocation. So he was a man very hard to kill, which is perhaps why he's still a myth to this day, because people say perhaps he did have some kind of magical type powers. But it's more likely than anything else that he got very lucky with curing their son, and he didn't really cure him, more so that he helped treat, his illness. So some people, don't like Tsar Nicholas II because he has shown that he's not willing to share power with anyone. He'll kill people. His wife is listening to this crazy man. And then here comes Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin is leader of the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolshevik Party supports the ideas of Karl Marx and communism, and basically saying that we want a society where everyone is treated equally. We don't want a society where we have the aristocracy or nobility in power who own all the land, which was the case in Russia. We want a society where everyone shares the land and is able to work it together and shares the profits. And as Russia is becoming more of an industrialized society, they would like to see that, factory owners are not getting mega rich in terms of capitalism, but it's more so about, people are sharing, the resources and kind of sharing the wealth. And so everybody at the factory makes the same amount of money. Perhaps they even share the company together. Now, in communism, you are going to perhaps see a violent overthrow of the government to make this happen. And you are going to see some kind of command center kind of controlling things. But there are a lot of people in Russia who are starving during World War I, who are angry with the leadership of the Tsar, and this seems like a great idea. And so they continue fighting in World War I, but over time, we're starting to see more internal fights occur. What we see happen as we move into 1917 is that Tsar Nicholas II and his family are basically forced out of power. They are taken prisoner to their home, the Winter Palace. It is eventually stormed. They're eventually taken down below, we think, into like caves, and they are all assassinated. They're all slaughtered. It's pretty brutal. And that's the end of the royal family in Russia and of the Romanov dynasty. If you've ever seen the animated movie Anastasia, talking about, how maybe she survived and maybe she's the heir to the throne and, somehow she escaped. It's a great children's movie, but unfortunately it's a sad story where none of them escaped. It was the end of the Romanov line, and it has cleared the way for Vladimir Lenin to come to power. And honestly, Vladimir Lenin was basically the secret weapon of the Germans. He had lived in Russia years earlier. He'd been a political radical, meaning someone with extreme ideas. He'd been kicked out of Russia. The Germans were the ones to actually smuggle him back into Russia because they knew that he had these, local supporters, which we called Soviets, or different societal groups, and that he was a charismatic leader, and that people were hungry and they were tired, they wanted change, they would support communism, the more extreme form of socialism, and that they would follow him anywhere. And so, even with the Tsar being taken out of power, you've got some people who actually wanted him out of power, but they don't necessarily want communism. They want to create a democracy. They want to have a country where they can elect their leaders. For a while, they did have a temporary leader elected who was quickly overthrown, and Lenin basically seized power. Some people, though, are still not happy with Lenin, and so there is a huge civil war ripping Russia apart, where some people say, we want out of this war. That's our number one goal. But we don't want to back Lenin because it seems like he's stolen the throne and murdered the royal family, and we want to elect our leaders, and we don't want to become communists. That sounds scary. We want to be able to have a society where we have our own wealth. Eventually, though, Lenin is able to fully take power. He promises peace, bread, and land to the people, which is exactly what happens when he negotiates what we call the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, where he gets Russia out of World War I, but he has to agree to give up lots of territory, which would make up parts of present-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine. He gives away all this land to basically say, I surrender, we're out of the war. And this is devastating for the Allied powers because now basically there is no more Eastern Front. They've already conquered Serbia, and if you're looking at the map, the Ottoman Empire, bad guy. Austro-Hungary, bad guy. Bulgaria, bad guy. And since Serbia is out, all of the fighting really moves back to France and the Western Front, and Germany really feels like it's going to win. This is about the same time that the US declares war, and it says that they are going to join World War I on the Allied side. And so Germany is hoping that they can ramp up, their attacks at sea. They can amp up their attacks on the Western Front, and then they can somehow win this war before the United States even gets involved. Since Russia is out, it's become a communist country. The communists eventually win in the Civil War with the Reds against the Whites. So as the war is really kind of going to be moving towards the Western Front, the Americans are finally going to be getting over there, or are they? The first task, besides training troops, remember, which we call doughboys, is how do we get them overseas? And so General John J. Pershing, who's head of the American Expeditionary Force, which is what we call the first big army unit, which is going to be going over to France and fighting the trenches, commanding the doughboys, getting them ready and mobilized, is how do you get those boys overseas? Because that's the first problem. Because remember, the Germans are using unrestricted submarine warfare. They are attacking anyone and everyone that tries to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And now that we're the enemy, and we have to cross all the way across the Atlantic to get our boys over there so we can fight, they're willing to blow up anybody and everybody. And so this is the first real scare. The other issue is we need to get over lots of supplies because, yes, Russia is out of the war. We're not going to be giving any supplies to them, but France is still just kind of hanging on by a thread. Those boys need food. They need guns. We need to get tanks over there so that we can try to end trench warfare. How are we going to get the stuff over there without it getting blown up by Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare? So the answer to that is the convoy system. And so the convoy system is basically the idea that you're going to take the merchant ship or the ship that is full of all of the soldiers and the sailors, and you're going to surround it by other ships. So in the picture you can see you've got a merchant ship, and so if it's got the machine guns, the tanks, the canned food, all the supplies that they need, they kind of have like a safe zone, so to speak, we think, around them, because we're putting cruisers, destroyers, we're kind of creating this defensive boundary around the boats as they travel together in what we call a convoy, so that if the enemies do try to launch a torpedo and the U-boats do try to, take their submarines and attack the merchant ships, they're not going to get to them. They're going to blow up some other ships on the sides. And yes, that's a tragedy. Yes, those people will die, but our main goal at this point is to get food, guns, tanks, supplies over to Europe. And then, of course, the other goal is to get men over to Europe so that we have millions of men to kind of, help fight against the Germans as they're really kind of taking the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottoman Empire, and, really kind of turning their attention in this world war towards France and the Western Front. We also see at this point the Navy is playing a huge role, and our battleships are laying mines across the North Sea to try to keep the U-boats out of the Atlantic. What ends up happening is we do end up attacking some of the German ships as well and, launching these mines and blowing them up. And it's hard for the Germans to quickly rebuild, to replace these boats, and then to replace the submariners because they don't have another bad guy joining the war. But at this point, the amount of Allied powers, despite Russia's absence, is growing. So we're finally able to get to France. This page you really don't have to write down, honestly. It's just kind of factual, but it won't be on the test. So overall, as far as American participation in the war, we're looking at almost 5 million total participation as far as men in the armed services, whether it's the Army or the Navy. About 1.39 million men are going to, 1,390,000 are going to be actually stationed in France, fighting in 13 major battles. From the time that we declare war in April of 2017 to the time the war is over and the peace treaty is signed, it's going to be about 19 months total. So that's not really that long, considering it's been going on for 3.5 years. So as I've been saying, when the U.S. gets there, we really bring the morale, the optimism, the supplies, the new strategies, and we're able to win. Overall, though, this war is going to be incredibly expensive, and we're looking at $21.85 billion total in terms of cost. And so it's really going to have a huge impact on the economies of all these countries and what happens in the 1920s. So let's talk about the last of the major battles. In terms of the last of the major battles, so the United States declares war, and it's going to take us a while to get our troops mobilized, prepared, ready to go. I mean, there's no other way to explain it to you. It takes us months. We're not ready. So even though we declare war, it takes us a long time before we actually get there. And then once we're actually, ready to go, it takes a long time to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So the French, the British continue to fight the Germans, especially as, fighting kind of amps up in the Western Front. They're able to hold the Germans off for the most part. And what we're going to look at here is really the end of the war. And what we see happen as far as some of the bloodiest battles is what happens June 1st through June 26th of 1918. Basically, at this point, the Germans are going to be launching what they call their last major offensive. Their thought process was, not all of the Americans are there yet. The American Expeditionary Force is landing on the western coast of France, but more and more men are going to be coming day by day. They know that the Americans have a huge population. They can fight this war for years if need be. The Germans don't have that advantage. Their men are tired, they're dying, they're exhausted. So they decide before the Americans all get into place and all get overseas, they are going to launch this major offensive in the Battle of Belleau Woods, where they are going to be trying to push towards Paris and put the French army on the run and really kind of head towards Paris and get behind the enemy lines. If you look at the diagram below, you can really kind of see what's going on here, where you've got the German positions there in red. And this is going to be a huge battle where we're talking about massive casualties. And the French are actually going to retreat somewhat as the Germans are advancing on their position. And you can kind of see the Germans taking over that territory in red. However, the Americans are pretty crazy. The American Expeditionary Force, led by Pershing, you've got the Marines there, and you don't have to write down the third point. You could just write down the first 2 points. But one of the U.S. Marines, Marine Captain Lloyd W. Williams, in a very famous quote, when they are told by the French try to get there and tell the Americans what to do, and the Americans under General Pershing say, why would we listen to you? We want to work with you. We want to help you. We're in this war together. But why would we listen to you? You're losing. Clearly, you need us and a new strategy. So Marine Captain Lloyd W. Williams says, retreat. Hell, we just got here. And so the Marines are crazy. They advance forward. They take heavy casualties. They refuse to leave. They stand their ground. And they stop the German advance, which was huge, because if they had let the Germans advance further, things would have been even worse. And so this is a devastating battle, huge casualties. This is when many of the African-American troops are fighting in this unit, and they'll eventually, win the Medal of Honor later because of the heavy, artillery fire here. Eventually, this whole wooded area is renamed for the U.S. Marines. Now, in response to the Germans getting almost all the way to Paris, the French decide that, okay, clearly the Marines are right. We have to hold our ground. We have to stop them, because if Paris falls, game over, and the U.S. don't even have all their troops here yet. So they launch a huge counteroffensive here in what's called the Spring Offensive, as we're going from the spring to the summer of 1918. And during this time period, another huge battle is fought near the Marne River, and so we call this the Second Battle of the Marne, very creative title. And eventually, the Germans are going to start to retreat, and slowly but surely, we're going to start pushing them back all the way through France, all the way back towards Belgium and towards the German border. And part of the reason we are so successful is what I've been saying. We refuse to listen to them. We refuse to just stay in trenches. We go over the top. Yes, we're going to suffer heavy casualties, but eventually we take the next trench. We use tanks to go between the two trenches. We're starting to see actual dogfights or fights in the air. So we're going to be using our planes to attack men in those trenches since we have heavy artillery fire. So we're willing to try whatever it takes to basically end this war of attrition where you're just wearing down the other side and we actually win. This is what I'm talking about. There's nothing to write down on this slide, but you can see that what we're doing here is you can look at all the arrows of the ones in blue here. These are major American offensives. And first we went at Amiens, and then there's Cantigny, there's Battle of Belleau Wood, and you can look at some of the major ones here, which I'm going to talk about next with Saint Mihiel, and then along the Meuse River. This is where Verdun was originally. And then eventually about pushing back into Belgium and eventually back into Germany. The fighting at this point has never been Germany. But this is all about the Allies finally taking the offensive, breaking the stalemate where no one's winning, and we're trying to push the Germans to actually surrender. And so the last 100 days of the war is bloody, it's crazy, it's wild. In this last 100 days offensive, the Allies are trying to, push the Germans basically out of France, perhaps back through Belgium and into Germany. And some of the bloodiest battles, one of the most important battles in world history, is the Battle of the Meuse River and Argonne Forest, which is what you just saw here, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, and which really goes on between September and November of 1918 during those last 100 days of the war. I remember, by the time we declared war and actually got over here, it took a long time. And then the actual fighting really does not go on for very long. We'll have an armistice where we stop fighting, and then it takes a long time to create the peace treaty. So they're counting our 19 months of being in this war from the time we declare it, even though there's no fighting yet, to all the way when the peace treaty is signed. So it's not actual a lot of time of boots on the ground. In this battle of the Meuse River and Argonne Forest, though, 600,000 American troops are fighting. So this is significant because it is the most massive attack in American history. Never have we had so many American troops fighting in one battle. We are just physically overwhelming the Germans at this point, who have heavy casualties. They don't have enough Austro-Hungarians and Ottoman Empire troops to help fight. It's pretty much them on their own. We're going to have some major heroes fighting in this battle. Alvin York, the guy that you see on the left, I love his plane. This is what I was talking about. Look at his cockpit. He just has a little piece of glass in front. Otherwise, his head is pretty much exposed. He wears goggles and basically just kind of a cap. Those guns are just kind of mounted to the side. And then he obviously is going to try to shoot while flying. And we're going to see that for the first time, it's not just really about spy planes, but we're going to start seeing towards the end of the war here. We've actually got, and I said Alvin York before, I apologize. I meant to say Eddie Rickenbacker. But we've got people like Eddie Rickenbacker who are, attacking with their Aero Squadron other planes in the air, but they're also trying to shoot men on the ground. They're trying to shoot buildings and blow them up. They're trying to kill men in trenches. They're trying to take out, men who are shooting machine guns. So huge heroes here. And we really see that the technology has really changed throughout the course of the war. Planes are playing a more important role than ever. Eventually, the Red Baron, the famous German pilot, is going to be taken down. We've also got other heroes. Sergeant York. He honestly was kind of an interesting man. Originally, he was what we call a conscientious objector, meaning he didn't want to fight. He was a pacifist. He got drafted. He decided to do his part and support the war effort. He ends up taking down a machine gun nest, so someone, who is firing the machine gun and kind of in a safe position and is basically, able to really kind of almost like a sniper and take out the enemy. He takes out the machine gun nest. He saves who knows how many lives, and he's able to free 132 prisoners who were held behind enemy lines. And so eventually a movie is made about him, starring Gary Cooper in, I think, the 30s. So this is where some of the American heroes are really going to shine here as we come in, and honestly, we're helping save the day. At this point, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire surrender. They see the writing on the wall. We're going to lose, or they're going to lose, I should say. The Americans are going to win, and they're hoping that if they surrender now, they can perhaps negotiate some kind of easier peace treatment. Ottoman Empire, eventually, since they are surrendering and they admit that they are defeated and they lose, there's been trouble in the Ottoman Empire for quite some time throughout the war. Lawrence of Arabia, a British man, had gone in and he'd been giving money and guns to the locals to help them revolt. These people had wanted their freedom from the Ottoman Empire for some time, because we see it's a very mixed empire, some Muslim, some Christian, and they, in terms of nationalism, they want to be free. And so eventually the Ottoman Empire will break apart. Bulgaria will lose some land. The Austria-Hungary will break apart into separate countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Austria, you name it. Yet again, in terms of nationalism. Now, as the war actually comes to Germany, Kaiser William II, the King of Germany, refuses to surrender. He wants to keep fighting till every last man is there. People like Adolf Hitler, who is fighting for Austria-Hungary on the Central Powers side, they wanted to fight till every last man was surrounded or dead and felt like they still could have come back and won this war. As the war comes into German cities like the city of Kiel, an industrial center, people start to freak out in Germany and they say, oh my gosh, what about our families? What if they get killed? What if our homes get burned down? What if our women get raped? What if our kids get slaughtered? And they say, you know what? Clearly it's over. We want to end the war with some dignity. We don't want to see our families die. And we're hoping that yet again, if we surrender, we admit defeat. we can negotiate kind of a better peace treaty. And obviously everyone knows they're going to have to pay for part of the war and lose some land, but they're hoping that it would be more focused on equality. So Kaiser William II is kicked out of power. They decide to create a new country called the German Social Democratic Republic. They elect Frederick Ebert as their new leader, and he's going to be the one that signs the armistice. An armistice basically is an agreement saying there will be a ceasefire, no more shooting. They send a message saying November 11th at 11 o'clock, everyone will stop shooting. The telegram somehow gets through all the trenches. People were worried. Like, would they really stop shooting on November 11th? But they did. And so it was the 11th month, because that's November, the 11th day of November, at the 11th hour, all of a sudden, the guns stopped. And that's why to this day, we call it Veterans Day. Once upon a time, they thought about it as, the day we honored the Great War, but then when World War II happened, from here on out, we've called it in more recent years Veterans Day. And so that's it for this lecture. Next lecture you'll see on Monday. It'll be the last lecture about the peace treaty and how it isn't very fair and how it is, going to lead to future conflicts like World War II. And then next week you can look forward to your test and such. Have a great day.